In this video, we'll discuss the most important events that occurred over the last 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's get started. First, we'll talk about the direction of the combat operations, as our information suggests that the Russians have launched a third counterattack. According to Ukrainian sources, the Russians aim to decisively defeat Ukrainian forces and push them back, essentially to reclaim control over the Sudzha district. Let's delve into this further, as the information is very intriguing. First, let's talk about an article published by pro-Ukrainian sources. Before we begin, I want to mention something important. The Russians launched this offensive on November 7th, and it has now been about 36 or 24 hours since the operation began. However, we have yet to receive any videos that could confirm either the Russian attack, or the successful defense by the Ukrainians, or the successful offensive. We don't know exactly what's happening in this area, but several articles have been published by soldiers on the ground and those close to them. To start, let's look at a report from Deep State. They report that Russian forces have launched a new wave of offensive operations in Kursk, targeting Pogrebki, Zeleny Shliak, Darino, and Sudzha. The situation is beginning to clarify in the last area, while the main strikes were in other areas. Of course, the Russians are unlikely to stop and may continue large-scale attacks with new units involved. Deep State has reported this multiple times, and summarizing their report, we can conclude that they are trying to convey that the first attempt at an offensive, or rather, the first day of the Russian counteroffensive, was not particularly successful for the Russians. It was more successful for the Ukrainians, at least according to Deep State. Let's discuss another post by a pro-Ukrainian source, which states that a Russian counteroffensive has started near Kursk. As I mentioned, the author expected that they would reclaim their territory within 2 to 3 months. We'll see how realistic that is. Ukrainian forces had anticipated the Russian offensive 2 days ago. A couple of days ago, there was a rotation in Lyubimivka, where the 51st Regiment replaced the 137th Regiment, so the Russians completed the rotation and brought in fresh forces. Additionally, the author notes that a few days ago, the 1810th Marine Brigade received 40 new BTR-82A armored vehicles. He also mentions that the Russians introduced an additional 5,500 assault troops on the left flank. Thus, the Russians were prepared by November 7th. The author also reports that the Russians launched 3 attacks, which, according to him, were repelled by the Ukrainians, resulting in significant Russian losses. For instance, we can see in a subsequent post that the 1810th Marine Brigade used at least 14 of the 40 new BTR-82 as they received today. Out of those, 10 were destroyed, damaged, or abandoned. So, as you can see, according to the Ukrainian author, the Russians lost about 70 to 80% of the equipment they used in these attacks. This is the second pro-Ukrainian post, suggesting that the situation was difficult for the Russians. In contrast, pro-Russian sources present a very different picture. For instance, an article from a pro-Russian source connected with local military reports that Russian units have already entered Darino and are advancing successfully in Novaya Ivanovka. The Ukrainian armed forces are in complete disarray. They brought in prisoners, placing them at outposts without drones, proper equipment, food, water, or evacuation for the wounded. So, according to the Russian narrative, they have broken through Ukrainian defenses and are now attacking Ukrainians in Novaya Ivanovka, having entered several villages. Now let's return to the map to examine and understand what they are talking about. First, according to the Ukrainians, the Russians began their offensive toward Pogrebki, most likely along this road. Russian sources claim the Russians are pushing Ukrainians back in Novokranka. Additionally, our information indicates that intense clashes are taking place around Zeleny Shliak, and pro-Russian sources claim they reached Darino. This outlines the situation on the northern and western flanks of the Sudzha direction. According to Ukrainian mappers, the Russians are also attacking towards Sudzha. It appears the Russians are advancing along a line between Bolshaya Soldatskaya and Martinovka, trying to reach Ukrainian positions by the shortest route. In this area, we have several videos showing Russians bombing and attacking Ukrainian forces, likely as a prelude to the offensive. One video shows the use of FAB-3000 bombs. Today, November 8th, we expect to receive the first videos from both pro-Russian and Ukrainian sides. This footage should clarify whether the first day of the Russian offensive was successful or not. Either way, sources indicate that right before the start of the third Russian counteroffensive, the Ukrainians deployed a significant number of forces to this direction to slow down the Russians. I'll remind you that it is very important that since the beginning of November, we have received a significant number of videos showing Russian bombing and attacks on Ukrainian positions in Ukraine right in front of soldiers. Thus, since early November, the Russians have been attempting to destroy as many operational reserves as possible. You may remember this video, where we can see how the Russians managed to detect a concentration of Ukrainian troops near a village called Kyanitsa. After detecting this gathering, the Russians began shelling it with numerous Iskander missiles, causing significant losses for the Ukrainians. Additionally, we have many videos showing the Russians shelling Sumy with artillery and drones. Over the previous months, the Russians have continually bombed Sumy with drones and other means. Therefore, the Russians have likely prepared well, but we will only understand how well in the coming days as the Russians begin their counteroffensive. I would remind you that the first two Russian counteroffensives were quite successful. As a result of these offensives in September and November, the Russians regained control over large areas. We are talking about this region. Now the Russians plan to advance further, likely cutting off about half of this territory or even completely defeating the Ukrainians. So let's wait, and sooner or later we'll receive additional news. Now let's move to the Pokrovsk direction, as most of the news is coming from there. First, let's talk about some changes on the ground near Novo-Alexandrovka. According to pro-Ukrainian mappers, after clashes over the last 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions along this line of trees. As you can see, the changes affected only a small part of the tree line that the Russians were able to occupy, forcing the Ukrainians to retreat. Now we see that the Russians have created a wide front line from the village of Novo-Alexandrovka towards the village of Arkhangelskaya. The Russians may attempt to advance further north. Over the past 24 hours, there have been some changes, with the most significant being that, according to both pro-Ukrainian and neutral mappers, the Russians have completely captured the village of Novo-Alexeyevka. This change on the ground can be seen by comparing the map from November 7th with the start of November 8th. The Russians are advancing further. We also have reports that the Russians have fully captured the village of Novodmitrovka, as reported by neutral mappers. Furthermore, we have additional information about Russian advances near the village of Ilyinka. Here's a map from the end of November 7th and one from the beginning of November 8th. I'd remind you that the situation in this area is very dynamic. Just 2 days ago, we received information that the Russians had captured the village of Stepanovka. Yesterday, we learned that the Russians entered the village of Ilyinka, where fierce fighting occurred in the northeastern part of the settlement. The Ukrainians counterattacked the Russians at very close range, as you can see in this video. The Russians have also increased their pressure on this settlement, and most likely tomorrow or the day after, the Ukrainians will be forced to retreat from this area toward the village Berestki. Additionally, we are receiving ongoing reports about a first sabotage group that managed to secure a position in the village of Sontsevka. This suggests that this direction may be captured very quickly and soon. We also continue to receive information about the situation in the zone of responsibility of the southern troop grouping. The Russians continue their offensive towards Yelizavetovka, and very reliable pro-Russian sources claim that the southeastern part of the village is already fully under Russian control. Heavy fighting and clashes are ongoing there. Moreover, we received a video published by Russian sources showing Russian units and assault squads moving towards the settlement. We have not received any information from within the settlement itself, but we have many videos showing Russians advancing towards Ukrainian positions in the southeastern part of Yelizavetovka. Furthermore, there have been changes on the ground between this dense network of fortifications and the settlement itself. Here's what we know about these changes. Now let's move to the next topic. Today, we will also discuss the situation currently unfolding in this direction, as the Russians are showing increased activity there as well. Significant changes on the ground in favor of the Russians have occurred over the past week. Ukrainian sources report that Russian armored forces are ready to launch a powerful offensive in the Zaporizhzhia region. Ukrainian sources, citing intelligence data, also report this. Regarding changes on the ground, for instance, today, we again updated the map in favor of the Russians, based on this video. In this video, we see a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone flying over these three lines and coordinating the actions of Ukrainian artillery. Once the Ukrainian artillery received the coordinates, they began shelling these positions.